What happens when one of Hollywood's most beloved actresses finds herself in the hot seat, facing questions she never agreed to answer? The Today Show set became ground zero for one of the most uncomfortable moments in morning television history, and it all started so innocently. Before we dive into what went down, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me which celebrity interview moment shocked you the most. Now, let's get into it. The studio lights were bright as always, the cameras rolling, and Hoda Kotb sat across from Julia Roberts with that familiar warm smile that millions of viewers wake up to every morning. This was supposed to be a simple promotional interview, the kind Julia had done hundreds of times before. She was there to talk about her latest film, a drama that had been getting Oscar buzz for weeks. The energy in the room felt light, professional, exactly what you would expect. Hoda started with the softball questions, the ones that every publicist approves ahead of time. She asked about the filming process, about working with the director, about what drew Julia to the role in the first place. Julia answered with her trademark charm, that megawatt smile flashing as she described the creative journey. She talked about the character's complexity, about finding the emotional truth in difficult scenes, about the incredible cast she got to work alongside. Everything was going exactly as planned. Then Hoda leaned forward slightly, her tone still friendly but with a subtle shift that anyone paying attention would notice. She said, "So Julia, this character you play is going through a very public divorce in the film, dealing with betrayal and having to rebuild her life in front of cameras and tabloids. I have to ask, and I know this might be personal, but did you draw on any of your own experiences navigating relationships in the public eye?" The question hung in the air for just a moment too long. Julia's smile didn't fade completely, but it froze in a way that made it clear something had shifted. She gave a small laugh, the kind that sounds polite but carries a warning, and said, "Well, Hoda, you know I've always tried to keep my personal life separate from my work. I think the character's journey is universal enough that anyone who has experienced loss or change can relate to it." It was a perfect deflection, the kind of answer that any experienced actor knows how to give. It acknowledged the question without really answering it, redirecting back to the safe territory of the film itself. Most interviewers would have taken the hint and moved on, but Hoda, perhaps encouraged by her producers in her earpiece, or perhaps genuinely curious, decided to press just a little bit further. She nodded thoughtfully and said, of course, and I respect that you keep things private. But I think what makes your performance so powerful in this film is how raw it feels, how authentic the pain is when we see this woman's world falling apart. As someone who has been through very public relationship ups and downs yourself, I mean, we all remember certain moments in the tabloids over the years. Do you think that lived experience made it easier or harder to tap into those emotions on camera? Julia's posture changed. It was subtle, but if you watch the footage closely, you can see her shoulders tense, see the way her hands grip the armrest of her chair just a fraction tighter. Her voice remained steady, but there was an edge to it now, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. She said, "I think you're confusing my real life with tabloid narratives, Hoda. What ends up in gossip magazines has very little to do with reality, and I've certainly never used my personal pain as some kind of acting exercise." The studio suddenly felt different. The crew members standing just off camera shifted uncomfortably. You could sense that this conversation was veering into territory that no one had anticipated. Hoda, to her credit, tried to smooth things over with a quick smile and a light touch on Julia's arm, the kind of gesture meant to signal that everything was still friendly, still safe. She said, "Oh no, I didn't mean it like that at all. I just meant that you bring such depth to these roles, such truth, and I wondered if life experience informed that in any way. That's all I was trying to say." But Julia wasn't buying it. She pulled her arm back just slightly and said, "Hoda, with all due respect, we had an agreement about what topics would be covered in this interview. I came here to talk about the film, about the work, about the story we're trying to tell. I didn't come here to dissect my marriage or my relationships or whatever version of my life you've read about in the tabloids. The tension was palpable now. Hoda's smile had become more fixed, more professional, but you could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. She was a seasoned journalist, someone who had navigated thousands of interviews, and she knew she was losing control of this conversation. She tried one more time to redirect, saying, "Absolutely, I completely understand, and I apologize if I overstepped. Let's talk about the Oscar buzz surrounding the film, because there's a lot of talk about potential nominations, and your performance is getting incredible reviews." For a second, it seemed like the crisis had been averted. Julia took a breath, her expression softening just slightly, and she began to answer the question about award season and the industry's response to the film. She talked about how honored she was by the recognition, how the entire cast and crew had poured their hearts into the project. The conversation seemed to be back on track. But then Hoda made the decision that would turn this interview from uncomfortable to infamous. As Julia was mid-sentence, talking about the collaborative nature of filmmaking, Hoda interrupted her. She said, "Julia, I just have to ask one more thing, because I think our viewers would really appreciate your perspective on this. You've been in this industry for over 3 decades now. You've been at the top of your game for most of that time, and you've also been married multiple times. Do you think the pressure of fame makes it harder to maintain lasting relationships? Or is that just an excuse people use?" The silence that followed was deafening. Julia stopped talking completely, her mouth still slightly open from the sentence she had been interrupted in the middle of. She stared at Hoda with an expression that was somewhere between disbelief and anger. The color seemed to drain from her face, not from fear but from the sheer audacity of what had just been asked. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet but ice cold. She said, "Excuse me?" Hoda, realizing she might have gone too far, but committed now to the question, repeated it with slight modifications. She said, "I just mean, you've had such an incredible career, but your personal relationships have been very public, and I wondered if you had any advice for people trying to balance love and ambition, especially in such a demanding industry." Julia slowly removed the microphone clipped to her collar. The gesture was deliberate, unmistakable in its meaning. She said, "Hoda, this interview is over. I was very clear with your producers about what was off limits, and you've crossed that line multiple times now. I don't know if this is some kind of ratings grab or if you genuinely thought this was appropriate, but I'm not doing this." Hoda's professional mask slipped for just a moment, genuine concern flashing across her face. She said, "Julia, please, I'm sorry if I upset you. That wasn't my intention at all. Can we just take a beat and reset?" But Julia was already standing up, handing the microphone to a nearby producer who looked absolutely mortified. She said, "There's nothing to reset, Hoda. You knew what this interview was supposed to be about, and you chose to turn it into something else. I've been doing this long enough to know when someone is trying to create a moment at my expense." Hoda stood up as well, her hands raised in a placating gesture, trying to salvage what was quickly becoming a complete disaster. She said, "Julia, please, just sit back down for a moment. We can move on. We can talk about whatever you want to talk about. I really am sorry if I made you uncomfortable." Julia shook her head, a bitter laugh escaping her lips. She said, "You're sorry if you made me uncomfortable? Hoda, you didn't accidentally make me uncomfortable. You deliberately asked questions that my team specifically said were off limits. This wasn't some innocent mistake. You ambushed me on live television." The word ambushed seemed to hit Hoda hard. You could see her trying to maintain her composure, trying to keep her voice steady and professional. She said, "I wouldn't call it an ambush, Julia. These are questions that I think a lot of people wonder about. You're a public figure, you've lived your life in the spotlight, and sometimes that means addressing things that might be uncomfortable. That's part of being in this position." That response, that justification, seemed to be the breaking point. Julia's eyes narrowed, and when she spoke again, There was no trace of the warm, charming movie star that audiences had fallen in love with over the years. This was someone who had been pushed too far and was done playing nice. She said, "So, because I'm famous, because I've been successful, that means I owe you access to every painful moment of my life? That means you get to pry into my marriages, my relationships, my private struggles, all because people are curious? Is that really what you're telling me right now?" Hoda shifted uncomfortably, glancing briefly at the cameras that were still rolling, capturing every second of this confrontation. She said, "That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm saying that your fans, the people who have supported your career for decades, they feel connected to you. They care about you. And when you play characters going through similar struggles to what you might have experienced, they want to understand that connection. It's not malicious, Julia. It comes from a place of admiration." Julia crossed her arms, her expression hardening even more. She said, "Don't hide behind my fans, Hoda. Don't pretend this is about them caring about me. This is about you wanting a viral moment. This is about you wanting a clip that will get shared on social media, something that will get people talking about the Today Show. And you were willing to betray the trust and the agreement we had to get it." The accusation hung heavy in the air. Hoda's face flushed slightly, and you could see the internal struggle playing out. She was a professional, someone who prided herself on her interviewing skills and her ability to connect with guests, but she was also clearly caught between defending herself and trying to de-escalate the situation. She said, "I have been doing this job for a very long time, Julia, and I have never tried to exploit a guest for ratings. If I overstepped, it was because I genuinely thought these were important conversations to have. The film deals with these themes. Your character goes through these experiences, and I thought it was relevant." Julia laughed again, but there was no humor in it. She said, "The film deals with these themes, so that gives you permission to interrogate me about my personal life? Do you ask actors who play criminals if they've ever committed crimes? Do you ask actors who play doctors about their medical history? Or is it just when the topic is relationships and heartbreak that you suddenly decide the line between character and actor doesn't matter?" Hoda opened her mouth to respond, but Julia wasn't finished. She was on a roll now. Years of dealing with invasive questions and boundary-crossing interviews, clearly fueling her words. She said, "I have given this industry everything. I have worked my entire adult life. I have given performances that I'm proud of. I have shown up and done the work over and over again. And in return, people like you think you have the right to pick apart my personal life, to analyze my relationships, to treat my pain like it's some kind of entertainment." The other crew members on set had gone completely still. Nobody was moving, nobody was speaking. Even the camera operators seemed frozen, unsure whether they should keep filming or shut everything down. The energy in the studio had shifted from uncomfortable to genuinely distressing. Hoda finally found her voice again, and when she spoke, there was a defensive edge that hadn't been there before. She said, "Julia, I understand you're upset, but you're being unfair. I ask questions that any journalist would ask. This is what interviews are. We talk about your work. We talk about your life. We try to give the audience insight into who you are as a person, not just as an actress. That's the job." Julia shook her head slowly, her expression one of profound disappointment. She said, "No, Hoda. The job is respecting boundaries. The job is honoring agreements. The job is treating your guests like human beings instead of content to be mined. You want insight into who I am? I'm someone who shows up when I say I will. I'm someone who keeps my word. I'm someone who expects the same basic respect in return. And right now, you're showing me exactly who you are." That last line seemed to strike a nerve. Hoda's professional composure cracked, and there was frustration in her voice when she responded. She said, "You know what, Julia? Maybe you're right. Maybe I did push too hard. But can I tell you something honestly? The moment anyone asks you anything real, anything that isn't completely sanitized and pre-approved, you shut down. You accuse us of betrayal. But you came on a talk show, Julia. This is what talk shows do. We talk. Julia stared at her for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was eerily calm. She said, "You want to talk about what's real, Hoda? Here's what's real. I came here in good faith. I trusted that the Today Show would respect basic professional boundaries. I trusted that when your team agreed to certain parameters for this interview, that agreement would mean something. And you broke that trust. So yes, I'm walking away, because I don't owe you or anyone else my trauma as entertainment." Hoda took a step closer, her voice rising. She said, "Nobody is asking for your trauma, Julia. But you can't have it both ways. You can't build a career on being relatable and beloved, and then act like you're too precious to answer honest questions. Your fans deserve more than just rehearsed talking points." The phrase, "too precious," lit a fire in Julia. Her eyes flashed with genuine anger. She said, "Too precious? Is that what you think this is?" "Hoda, I have answered more invasive questions than you could possibly imagine over the course of my career. I have sat through interviews where people asked me about my body, my age, my love life, my failures, my insecurities. I have been poked and prodded and analyzed for decades. So don't you dare stand there and tell me I'm too precious because I finally drew a line." Hoda's jaw tightened, and she looked genuinely angry too. She said, "Then maybe you shouldn't have agreed to do the interview at all, Julia. Maybe you should have just stayed home if you weren't willing to actually engage. Because what you're describing, that's been the reality of celebrity for decades. And if you can't handle it anymore, that's fine, but don't blame me for doing my job." Julia's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but it carried across the entire studio. She said, "Your job was to interview me about my film. Your job was not to psychoanalyze my marriage history or use my personal life as fodder for your ratings. And the fact that you don't see the difference tells me everything I need to know." Julia picked up her purse, the gesture deliberate and final. She said, "You wanted a moment, and you got one, just not the one you were hoping for." She turned toward the exit. Hoda called out, her voice strained, "Julia, please, just wait. We can figure this out. Just give me another chance." Julia paused but didn't look back. She said, "Hoda, there's nothing to figure out. You made your choice when you asked those questions. I'm making mine now. And my choice is to walk away from a situation where I'm not being respected." Hoda's desperation was palpable. She said, "What do you want me to do, Julia? You want me to apologize on camera? Fine. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for asking about your personal life. I'm sorry if I crossed a line. Is that what you need to hear?" Julia finally turned back, but her expression was cold. She said, "It's not about what I need to hear, Hoda. It's about what you actually believe. And right now, I don't think you're sorry for asking the questions. I think you're sorry that I'm leaving. I think you're sorry that this isn't going the way you planned. But you're not actually sorry for disrespecting me. And that's the problem." One of the producers stepped forward. She said, "Julia, please, we can work this out. We can cut all of that out. We can start fresh. Whatever you need." Julia looked at the producer with something resembling pity. She said, "You can't cut it out. It already happened. And even if you could erase it from the tape, you can't erase it from my memory or from everyone in this room who heard it. The damage is done." Hoda's voice was thick with emotion. She said, "So that's it then? You're just going to walk out and make me look like the villain here?" Julia's eyes flashed. She said, "I'm not making you look like anything, Hoda. You did this. You chose to push when I asked you to stop. You chose to break our agreement. I'm not walking out to make you look bad. I'm walking out because staying would send the message that this behavior is acceptable, and it's not." Hoda called out one more time, her voice breaking. She said, "Julia, I really am sorry. I mean that. I got caught up in the moment, and I hurt you. That wasn't my intention." Julia stopped, and when she looked back, there was a glimmer of something softer in her eyes. She said, "You know what, Hoda? I actually believe that you didn't intend to hurt me. But intent doesn't erase impact. And the impact of what you did today is that you broke my trust and made me feel like my boundaries don't matter. So your apology, while I'm sure it's sincere, doesn't change the fact that I need to leave. Hoda seemed to deflate. She nodded slowly and said, I understand. I hope someday you'll give us another chance. Julia gave a small, sad smile. She said, maybe someday, but not today. And with that, she walked toward the studio exit. The cameras were still rolling, capturing every second. You could hear her heels clicking against the floor, each step echoing in the stunned silence. Nobody tried to stop her. They all just watched as one of the biggest movie stars in the world walked out, leaving behind a host who looked shell-shocked. As Julia reached the door, she paused one final time. She said, for the record, the film is really good. People should go see it. But they should see it because the story matters, not because of whatever circus this interview turned into. Then she pushed through the door and was gone. The studio remained frozen. Hoda stood in the middle of the set, staring at the empty doorway, her face a mixture of shock and regret. She looked directly at the camera, her voice shaky. She said, well, that was clearly not how we expected this interview to go. We're going to take a commercial break. The moment the camera operator signaled they were off air, Hoda sank into the chair Julia had vacated, putting her head in her hands. That was the moment Julia Roberts walked off the Today Show, leaving behind one of the most talked about interview disasters in recent memory. The footage spread like wildfire. Some people praised Julia for standing her ground. Others criticized her for being too sensitive. But at the end of the day, what happened in that studio was simple. One person asked questions that crossed a line, and another person refused to accept that as the price of fame. This interview changed the conversation about what we expect from celebrities and what they have the right to keep private. So what do you think? Was Julia justified in walking off, or did she overreact? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, and make sure you hit that subscribe button because we'll be covering more celebrity interview moments that went off the rails. Thanks for watching.